Alright, let's settle in, because we're diving deep into something really fascinating: ancient Egyptian mummies. But not just the usual image of wrapped bodies lying in tombs. We're going to uncover the mystery that lies beyond those layers of linen. Think of it as peeling back the wraps, not just on the mummy, but on the whole idea of what a mummy even is. For centuries, mummies have captured our imaginations. They're in museums, in movies, in our collective unconscious. They conjure up images of dusty tombs, hidden curses, and maybe even a little bit of the spooky undead. But strip away the Hollywood stuff, and you're left with something far more profound. It's a tangible link to a civilization that was incredibly sophisticated, deeply spiritual, and frankly, obsessed with the afterlife. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you look at an Egyptian mummy, you're not just looking at a preserved corpse. You're looking at the culmination of an elaborate set of beliefs, rituals, and skills that were developed over thousands of years. It's a window into the ancient Egyptian worldview, their understanding of life, death, and what came next. And believe me, they had some very specific ideas about what came next. This whole process wasn't just about preserving a body to prevent decay. If that was all they were aiming for, they could have just stuck someone in a block of ice. It was about transforming the deceased, preparing them for a journey into the afterlife, and ensuring their eternal existence. The Egyptians believed that a person's spirit, their kawan bar, needed a physical anchor, a familiar home to return to. The mummy provided that anchor. Without it, the spirit would be lost, unable to navigate the treacherous landscape of the underworld. But here's the thing: the physical body wasn't enough. The mummification process was also deeply intertwined with magic, religion, and symbolism. Every step, from the removal of the organs to the wrapping of the limbs, was carefully orchestrated to protect the deceased and equip them for the afterlife. Amulets were strategically placed among the layers of linen, each one imbued with specific powers to ward off evil spirits and ensure a safe passage. Prayers were recited, spells were cast, and rituals were performed to activate the magic and bring the mummy to life. Symbolically, of course. Think of it as upgrading your character before starting a new game. Only this game lasts for eternity. Now, when most people picture mummification, they picture a lengthy, complicated, and expensive process, and they'd be right. But it's important to remember that not everyone got the full pharaoh treatment. The cost of mummification varied depending on a person's wealth and status. The elite could afford the most elaborate procedures, with all the bells and whistles, the best resins, the finest linen, the most skilled embalmers. The less fortunate, however, might have to settle for a simpler, cheaper version, maybe just a quick drying with natron and a basic wrapping. So when we talk about mummies, we're not just talking about the perfectly preserved remains of royalty. We're also talking about the everyday Egyptians who, in their own way, were also striving for immortality. Their mummies might not be as glamorous, but they're just as important for understanding the full picture of ancient Egyptian beliefs and practices. They also show the societal value that was placed on even the most basic form of mummification that gave even a pauper a chance at an afterlife. What's also fascinating is how our understanding of mummies has evolved over time. In the past, mummies were often seen as curiosities, objects to be unwrapped and displayed, sometimes even ground up and used as medicine. Can you imagine? Now, thankfully, we approach them with much more respect and scientific rigor. Modern technology, like CT scans and DNA analysis, is allowing us to learn incredible things about the lives of these individuals, their health, their diet, their family relationships. So the next time you see a mummy in a museum, take a moment to really think about what you're looking at. It's not just a wrapped body, it's a story. It's a testament to human ingenuity, a reflection of deeply held beliefs, and a tangible link to a civilization that, despite being thousands of years in the past, still has the power to fascinate and inspire us today. Because the mystery of Egyptian mummies goes way beyond the wraps, it goes right to the heart of what it means to be human, to grapple with mortality, and to strive for something beyond the here and now. And isn't that a journey worth taking? I certainly think so. I hope you will as well. Let's dive in. Alright, settle in folks, because tonight we're going way back. We're talking ancient Egypt, and specifically the discovery of mummification. It's a story almost as old as the process itself, and just as fascinating. Think of it like this: we're not just stumbling upon a technique, we're uncovering layers of belief, ingenuity, and frankly a little bit of experimentation. Now, when did this all start? That's the million-dollar question. Pinpointing the exact origin of mummification is tricky, like trying to catch sand in your hands. But archaeological evidence, and yeah, a bit of educated guesswork, help us piece it together. The earliest forms of mummification weren't exactly the sophisticated, organ-removing, natron-drying processes we associate with pharaohs like Tutankhamun. No, it was much more natural. See, pre-dynastic Egyptians, that's before 3100 BC, were burying their dead in shallow pits in the desert sand. And the desert, as you might imagine, is pretty darn good at preserving things. The hot, dry sand naturally desiccated the bodies, preventing decay. Think beef jerky, but human. These early burials, while unintentional in their preservation, gave the Egyptians a front-row seat to the possibilities. They saw that bodies buried in the desert stayed intact, at least to some degree. That spark of observation was crucial. It laid the groundwork for a belief system that would eventually enshrine mummification as a vital step in the journey to the afterlife. So we're talking about a slow, gradual realization. A eureka moment wasn't written on any tomb walls. Instead, it was a creeping understanding, born from observation and evolving beliefs. They start thinking, maybe how we bury people matters. As Egyptian society developed, so did their burial practices. Around 3400 BC, we see a shift. Instead of simple pits, they started using more elaborate tombs. These tombs, while grander, actually hindered natural preservation. You see, lining the graves with wood and brick, while fancy trapped moisture, ironically speeding up decomposition. Oops, this presented a new problem, right? They were trying to honor their dead with nicer burials, but the bodies were decaying faster. This is where ingenuity comes in. They needed a way to combat the effects of these new damp tombs. It wasn't about creating preservation anymore. It was about restoring the natural preservation the desert provided. Think of it like this: the ancient Egyptians were facing a preservation crisis. Their fancy new tombs were backfiring, and they needed a solution to keep their loved ones intact for the afterlife. Early attempts at artificial mummification were, well, let's just say they were a work in progress. We see evidence of linen wrappings, sometimes soaked in resin. This was an attempt to create a protective barrier to keep moisture out, and let's be honest, probably to contain the smell. There's also evidence of packing bodies with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in abundance in Egypt. Natron is a desiccant, meaning it absorbs moisture. Remember that jerky analogy? Same principle. These early efforts weren't always successful. The techniques were crude, and the understanding of anatomy and decay wasn't fully developed. Some mummies from this period are messy, let's say, but they show a clear intent to preserve the body. And that intent, that drive to overcome the natural processes of decay, that's what truly matters. Now fast forward a few centuries, and we arrive at what's called the Old Kingdom, roughly 2686 to 2181 BC. This is when things start getting serious. Mummification becomes more refined, more standardized, especially for the elite. We see evidence of internal organs being removed, although not not always consistently. Sometimes they were put back inside, sometimes they weren't. Still figuring things out, you know? The goal was to remove the organs most prone to decay, which are the guts basically, and dry out the body more effectively. The use of natron becomes more widespread and sophisticated. They understood that completely covering the body in natron was key to drawing out moisture. It's during this period that we also see the development of canopic jars. Those are the jars used to store the removed organs, the liver, lungs, stomach and intestines. Each jar was associated with a specific god, one of the four sons of Horus, protecting the organ within. This reflects the increasing religious significance of mummification. It wasn't just about preserving the body anymore. It was about ensuring a successful transition to the afterlife, a journey that required a complete and intact body. Mummification was becoming a crucial part of the religious ritual, a rite of passage, if you will. It was a way to cheat death, to conquer the natural order, and the best part, mummification was now only accessible to the wealthiest, most powerful members of society. The pharaohs, naturally, got the VIP treatment. The process continued to evolve through the Middle Kingdom and into the New Kingdom, reaching its peak during the New Kingdom, from around 1550 to 1070 BC. This is when mummification becomes a true art form, a testament to Egyptian skill and dedication. The techniques are refined, the rituals are elaborate, and the results are, well, stunning. The internal organs are now routinely removed, embalmed, and stored in canopic jars. The brain, notoriously difficult to remove, is extracted through the nose with a hook. Gruesome, I know, but hey, gotta give them credit for creativity. The body is then thoroughly dried with natron for up to 70 days, then carefully wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Amulets are placed within the layers of linen to protect the deceased in the afterlife, and elaborate masks are placed over the face to ensure the spirit can recognize its body. It's all incredibly detailed. The entire process could take months, and it was expensive. This was the gold standard of mummification. The premium package, if you will, reserved for the pharaohs, their families, and the wealthiest members of society. So how did we, modern folk, rediscover all this information, this history of mummification? Well, that's another interesting story. While the process itself originated in ancient times, knowledge about it had been lost to the sands of time, pun intended. Over the centuries, mummies were often viewed as curiosities, objects of superstition, or even ingredients for medicine, which is, yeah, let's not go there. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of Egyptology, that people started taking a more scientific interest in mummies. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 sparked a frenzy of exploration and discovery. European scholars and adventurers flocked to Egypt, drawn by the allure of ancient civilization. They excavated tombs, collected artifacts, and yes, unwrapped mummies. These early unwrapping ceremonies were often chaotic affairs, more like public spectacles than scientific investigations. Mummies were unwrapped for the entertainment of onlookers, with little regard for preserving the artifacts or studying the body. But even these crude unwrapping revealed valuable insights into the mummification process. As Egyptology developed into a more scientific discipline, the study of mummies became more rigorous. Researchers started using careful documentation, detailed anatomical studies, and eventually modern technologies like X-rays and CT scans to learn more about the lives and deaths of ancient Egyptians. So, that's the journey, a winding path through time and sand, from unintentional preservation to the sophisticated art of mummification. It is more than just dead bodies, it's about beliefs and society. Alright, let's settle in and delve into why the ancient Egyptians went to such elaborate lengths to mummify their dead. It wasn't just about preserving a body, it was deeply rooted in their religious beliefs and their vision of the afterlife. Think of it as the ultimate pre-departure checklist for a journey to eternity. For the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't an ending, but a transition, a doorway. A fresh start, really, in a world that mirrored their own, but ideally even better. This afterlife, often depicted as the field of reeds or Aru, wasn't just a vague concept. It was a very real place, a sort of idealized version of Egypt itself. Lush fields, flowing rivers, and everything a person needed to continue their existence. Just like here, but with the heavenly seal of approval. To get there though, you needed to be prepared. And that's where mummification came in. It wasn't just about keeping the body intact. It was about making sure the whole person was ready for this journey and the challenges that lay ahead. At the heart of this belief system was the concept of the K and the bar. The K was essentially your life force, your vital spark. It needed the body to remain intact, or at least recognizable, so it had a place to return to. Think of it like needing a home base. Without a properly preserved body, the K would wander aimlessly, lost and unable to access the afterlife. Not a good look. And then there's the bar. The bar was more like your personality, your soul, your unique essence. It was often depicted as a bird with a human head, free to fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But even the bar needed the body to exist. It needed a familiar anchor, a place to remember its earthly existence. So mummification was designed to keep these two vital aspects of a person together, connected to the physical form, ensuring their continued existence in the afterlife. It was like building a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. But it wasn't just about the K and the bar. There was also the AKH, the transfigured spirit. This was the ultimate goal, to become an AKH, a luminous being capable of dwelling in the afterlife alongside the gods. But to achieve this transformation, you had to pass through the trials of the underworld. Now, this is where things get interesting. The journey to the field of reeds wasn't exactly a walk in the park. It involved navigating a treacherous underworld filled with monsters, demons, and all sorts of nasty creatures. And then, the ultimate test, the weighing of the heart ceremony. Imagine this. You stand before Osiris, the god of the underworld, and Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. Your heart, the seat of your emotions and your conscience, is placed on one side of a scale, and on the other side, a feather, the feather of Mart, the goddess of truth and justice. If your heart was lighter than the feather, it meant you had lived a virtuous life. You were pure of heart, worthy of entering the field of reeds. Congratulations, you've passed. But if your heart was heavier than the feather, well, let's just say things didn't end so well. A monstrous creature called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, was waiting to devour your heart, obliterating your soul, and condemning you to eternal non-existence. Ouch. So, how did mummification help you prepare for this ultimate judgment? Well, it was believed that the rituals performed during the mummification process, the prayers, the incantations, all helped to purify the heart, to cleanse it of sin, and prepare it for the weighing of the heart ceremony. Furthermore, the amulets and spells placed on the mummy served as protection against the dangers of the underworld. Think of them like cheat codes for the afterlife. They were meant to ward off evil spirits, provide guidance through the treacherous landscape, and help you navigate the challenges that lay ahead. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers, was often buried with the mummy to provide further assistance on this journey. It was like a guidebook for the afterlife, offering instructions on how to overcome obstacles, answer the questions of the gods, and ultimately achieve eternal bliss. So you see, mummification wasn't just a gruesome process of preserving a dead body. It was a sacred ritual, a deeply spiritual act that was designed to ensure the deceased's successful transition to the afterlife. It was an expression of the ancient Egyptians' profound belief in the power of life after death, and their unwavering commitment to preparing their loved ones for this ultimate journey. It wasn't just about wrapping bodies in linen, it was about wrapping them in hope, in faith, and in the promise of eternal life. It was in essence their way of cheating death, or at least making it a little less final. Pretty neat, huh? Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to dive deep into the nitty-gritty of how the ancient Egyptians actually made a mummy. It's way more involved than just wrapping someone in a bunch of linen, I promise you. This was a complex, almost ritualistic process carried out by skilled embalmers and priests. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of advanced surgery combined with spiritual preparation, and trust me, it took a while. Like 70 days on average. So grab your favorite blanket, maybe a warm drink, and let's get started. First things first, the body would be brought to the abiu, or place of purification. This was basically a tent, or a series of tents specifically set up for the mummification process. Here, the body would be washed and cleansed with water from the Nile, and various solutions to remove any impurities. Imagine it as a super intense spa treatment, but for someone who, wasn't exactly alive anymore. Next, and this is where things get a little intense, is the removal of the internal organs, except for the heart, which was believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, and therefore crucial for the afterlife. All the other major organs were taken out. The embalmers would make an incision, usually on the left side of the abdomen, using a special obsidian blade, nice and sharp for the job. Then, very carefully, they'd remove the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. Now, these organs weren't just tossed aside, they were considered important and were preserved separately in what we now know as canopic jars. We'll get into those funky jars later, but for now, just picture each organ getting its own special little condo for eternity. Now, about that brain, that's where the process gets, well, a little bit squicky. The ancient Egyptians didn't really understand the brain's function, so they didn't bother preserving it in the same way. Instead, they'd liquefy it and remove it through the nostrils, using a long hooked instrument. Yeah, I know. Not the most pleasant image, but hey, it was ancient Egypt. Once the organs were removed, the next crucial step was dehydration. You see, bodies decompose because of moisture, so to prevent that, the embalmers would pack the inside of the body with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in Egypt. Natron is an amazing desiccant, meaning it sucks up moisture like nobody's business. They'd also cover the outside of the body with natron. Think of it as being completely surrounded by thirsty sponges, drawing out every last bit of liquid. This process usually took about 40 days, leaving the body completely dried out and well mummy-like. After the natron treatment, the body would be washed again and then stuffed with linen or sawdust to restore its shape. Remember, it had just spent 40 days being completely dehydrated, so it was probably looking a little deflated. The embalmers would want the deceased to look as lifelike as possible for their journey to the afterlife. Sometimes, they'd even use mud or resin to sculpt the face and other features, making the mummy look almost serene. Now for the fun part, wrapping. This was a long, meticulous process that could take several days. The embalmers would use strips of fine linen, often hundreds of yards long, to carefully wrap the entire body. Each layer was coated with resin, which acted as an adhesive and helped to further preserve the mummy. The wrapping wasn't just random, either. Specific prayers and incantations were recited as each layer was applied, imbuing the mummy with magical protection. And speaking of magical protection, amulets played a huge role in the wrapping process. These were small charms and symbols made of various materials, like faience, gemstones, or metal. They were placed strategically between the layers of linen to ward off evil spirits and ensure the deceased's safe passage through the underworld. Amulets of the D-Jade pillar for stability, the Ankh for life, and the scarab beetle for rebirth were just a few of the common charms used. It was like giving the mummy a full suit of spiritual armor. Once the entire body was wrapped, a final shroud would be placed over the mummy. Often this shroud would be painted with images of gods and goddesses, further invoking their protection. A mask, often made of cartonnage, layers of linen and plaster, was then placed over the face. This mask was intended to represent the deceased and help their soul, or ba, recognize their body in the afterlife. These masks could be simple or incredibly elaborate, some even made of gold and inlaid with precious stones for the really important folks. Finally, the mummy was ready to be placed in its coffin. or, more often, coffins. Wealthy Egyptians would often have multiple coffins, nested one inside the other, like a set of Russian dolls. These coffins were usually made of wood, often cedar, and decorated with elaborate paintings and inscriptions. These inscriptions often included prayers, spells, and scenes from the Book of the Dead, a guide to navigating the afterlife. The innermost coffin was often shaped like the person, offering one last visual connection to their life on Earth. So, there you have it, a detailed step-by-step look at the ancient Egyptian mummification process. It was a long, complex, and fascinating ritual, driven by deeply held religious beliefs and a desire to ensure eternal life for the deceased. And it's a testament to the skill and ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians that these mummies have survived for thousands of years, giving us a glimpse into their beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the enduring power of the human spirit, or at least what's left over. Now, before you drift off completely, we'll have to get into these super cute canopic jars next. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to dive into one of the most fascinating and honestly kinda gross parts of ancient Egyptian mummification, the canopic jars. Yeah, I know, jars filled with, well, we'll get there, but trust me, these weren't just random containers. They were vital for ensuring a smooth afterlife experience for the deceased, and they're steeped in symbolism and religious belief. So imagine you're an ancient Egyptian, chilling in your tomb, ready to begin your journey to the next world. You've been carefully mummified, wrapped in layers of linen, and surrounded by all sorts of goodies to make your afterlife comfy. But, where are your vital organs? You kinda need those, right? Well, this is where the canopic jars come in. During the mummification process, the Egyptians carefully removed the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. Why these organs and not others? Good question. These were considered the most susceptible to decay, and therefore the biggest threats to the preservation of the body. And a well-preserved body was absolutely crucial for your life force, to recognize you in the afterlife. Now, these organs weren't just tossed into any old. Each one was placed in its own specially decorated canopic jar, and each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus, who were, in turn, protected by specific goddesses. Think of it as a super-powered security system for your insides. Let's break it down, shall we? First up, we have Imsiti, usually depicted with a human head. He was the guardian of the liver and was protected by the goddess Isis, one of the most powerful and important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Isis, known for her magic, protection, and motherhood, ensured that the liver stayed safe and sound for eternity. Next, we have Hapi, who had the head of a baboon. He watched over the lungs and was guarded by Nephthys, Isis's sister. Nephthys was often associated with mourning and protection, making her a perfect fit for safeguarding the lungs, which, let's be honest, probably weren't in the best shape after being removed from a body. Then there's Duamutef. Sporting the head of a jackal, he was responsible for the stomach and was under the protection of Neith, a fierce and ancient goddess of weaving and warfare. Neith was a powerful protector, ensuring that the stomach, the thing that digests all that yummy afterlife food, was well guarded. And finally, we have Qubus Neith, who had the head of a falcon. He protected the intestines and was guarded by Serket, a scorpion goddess known for her healing powers and protection against venomous creatures. Considering the intestines' job is to process waste, having a scorpion goddess watching over them seems pretty appropriate, right? Now, you might be wondering, okay, they have gods and goddesses protecting them, but what about the jars themselves? Were they just plain old containers? Absolutely not. The canopic jars were often beautifully crafted from materials like alabaster, limestone, or pottery. They were decorated with hieroglyphs, prayers, and scenes from the afterlife, all designed to further ensure the safe passage of the organs into eternity. The lids of the jars are particularly interesting. Early on, they were often just plain flat discs, but over time, they evolved into the iconic heads of the 4 sons of Horus, making them even more symbolic and visually striking. it wasn't just about protection. It was about visually representing the deities who were watching over these precious organs. And get this, the placement of the canopic jars within the tomb was also very deliberate. They were usually arranged in a specific order, often near the sarcophagus, to ensure they were always close to the mummified body. Some tombs even had canopic chests designed specifically to hold the jars, further emphasizing their importance. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the organs in the jars. I know, it's a bit gruesome, but it's important to understand. Before being placed in the jars, the organs were typically treated with natron, a natural salt mixture, to dehydrate and preserve them. They were also sometimes wrapped in linen bandages, just like the body. So, it wasn't just a case of slopping them into a jar, there was care and ritual involved. And here's where it gets even more interesting. While the standard practice was to remove and preserve these 4 organs, there were some variations. For example, the heart, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion, was usually left inside the body. The Egyptians believed the heart was essential for judgment in the afterlife, so they weren't about to risk losing it. The brain, on the other hand, was often considered less important. While they did remove it, the process wasn't as careful or ritualistic as the treatment of the other organs. Often it was extracted through the nose using a hook, and then, well, discarded. Harsh, right? So what does all this tell us? Well, the canopic jars and their contents weren't just about preserving organs. They were about ensuring the deceased had everything they needed to be reborn and thrive in the afterlife. They were a testament to the ancient Egyptians' deep-seated beliefs about death, resurrection, and the importance of maintaining the physical body for eternity. They're a reminder that even the seemingly gruesome aspects of mummification were rooted in a profound spiritual understanding of life and death. And honestly, thinking about it, it's kind of sweet. I mean, imagine someone caring so much about your internal organs that they dedicate deities and beautifully crafted jars to protect them for all eternity. That's some serious dedication, right? So the next time you see a canopic jar in a museum, don't just think of it as a creepy container of organs. Think of it as a symbol of love, protection, and the enduring human desire to conquer death and live forever. And maybe, just maybe, send a little thank you to Imsiti, Hepi, Duamutef, and Kebesenutef for keeping those ancient Egyptian organs safe and sound all these years. They deserve it. Sleep tight, everyone. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to get up close and personal. Well, as personal as you can get with someone who's been dead for a few thousand years. We're diving headfirst into the fascinating world of ancient Egyptian mummy masks. Now, when you picture an Egyptian mummy, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably a linen-wrapped figure lying in a sarcophagus, right? But there's often something incredibly beautiful and intricate covering the face of that mummy, a mask. And trust me, these weren't just afterthoughts. They were absolutely integral to the whole mummification process, steeped in symbolism and crafted with unbelievable artistry. Think of it this way, the mask wasn't just a pretty face, it was a passport to the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that after death, the soul, or Ka, needed a recognizable form to return to. The mask served as a permanent, idealized representation of the deceased, ensuring their spirit could find its way back to the body. Without the mask, the Ka might get lost, wander aimlessly, and basically become spiritually homeless. No one wants that, right? These masks were way more than just portraits, though. They were heavily symbolic, packed with religious meaning, and often reflected the social status and wealth of the person who had shuffled off this mortal coil. The materials used, the colors chosen, and the imagery included all told a story about the deceased's identity and their hopes for the afterlife. Let's talk about materials for a sec. Gold was a big one, and I mean big. Think King Tut's iconic golden mask. Gold was associated with the sun god Ra and represented immortality and eternal life. So if you were a pharaoh or someone super important, you'd likely get a mask made of solid gold, or at least gilded with it. It's like saying, hey, afterlife, I'm here to stay. But gold wasn't the only option. Mummy masks could also be made of cartonnage, which is basically layers of linen or papyrus plastered together and then painted and gilded. Cartonnage was a more affordable option, making masks accessible to a wider range of people, not just the mega rich. We even see masks made of wood, sometimes inlaid with glass or precious stones. The material really depended on your budget and status. Now, onto the faces themselves. These weren't meant to be hyper-realistic portraits like you'd get from a Renaissance painter. Instead, they were idealized representations, showing the deceased in their prime, youthful and serene. They typically had a calm, peaceful expression, reflecting the tranquility they hoped to find in the afterlife. And those eyes, often large and wide open, symbolizing alertness and awareness in the afterlife. They're almost always almond-shaped and carefully outlined, drawing your attention to the gaze. The Egyptians believed the deceased could still see and interact with the world, so the eyes were super important. Don't forget about the headdresses. The type of headdress on a mummy mask was another huge indicator of status. Pharaohs often wore the Nem's headdress, the striped headcloth you probably recognize from countless images. It symbolized royal power and protection. Queens often wore a vulture headdress, representing the goddess Nekhbet, a protector of royalty. The common folk, on the other hand, might have simpler headdresses, or even just a wig painted onto the mask. And now to the beard, or rather, the false beard. This was a symbol of royalty and divine power, even for female rulers like Hatshepsut. It was usually long, narrow, and slightly curved at the end, attached to the chin of the mask. It was like the ultimate power accessory. Color me impressed with this information, but what about color on the mask? Color was key in ancient Egyptian art in general, and mummy masks were no exception. Each color had a specific meaning. Blue represented the heavens and the Nile, green symbolized rebirth and vegetation, and red was associated with fire, and gold, as we discussed, symbolized immortality. So the colors on a mask weren't just decorative, they were carefully chosen to convey specific messages. Beyond the face and headdress, mummy masks were often adorned with various religious symbols and inscriptions. You might see images of gods and goddesses, like Osiris, the god of the afterlife, or Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. These images were meant to offer protection and guidance to the deceased on their journey through the underworld. You'd often find inscriptions of prayers and spells from the Book of the Dead, a collection of funerary texts that were supposed to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. These spells could help them overcome obstacles, ward off evil spirits, and ultimately achieve eternal life. Think of them as a cheat sheet for the afterlife. It's important to remember that the masks were made and used over thousands of years, so their style and design changed over time. Early masks were often simpler and more stylized, while later masks became more elaborate and detailed. Roman period masks, for example, often featured realistic hairstyles and clothing, reflecting the influence of Roman culture. And where did all these masks wind up? You guessed it, inside the sarcophagus, right over the mummy's face. The mask was carefully placed to ensure a perfect fit, protecting the face and ensuring the deceased's spirit had a recognizable form to return to. The whole package, the mummy, the mask, the sarcophagus, was a complete system designed to guarantee eternal life. Now, finding a complete mummy mask is a pretty big deal for archaeologists. They offer an unparalleled glimpse into the beliefs and practices of the ancient Egyptians. By studying the materials, the symbolism, and the inscriptions on a mask, we can learn a ton about the person who wore it, their social status, their religious beliefs, and their hopes for the afterlife. So the next time you see an ancient Egyptian mummy mask in a museum, remember that it's more than just a pretty artifact. It's a window into the soul of someone who lived thousands of years ago, a testament to their belief in eternal life, and a remarkable work of art in its own right. It's truly a face to remember. Alright, settle in, because we're diving deep into the layers, quite literally, of ancient Egyptian mummies. I mean, we've taken out the organs, dried the body, now comes the really hands-on part, wrapping. but trust me, it's way more than just bandages. Think of it as building a fortress, layer by layer, to protect our VIP on their journey to the afterlife. So first, the linen, mountains of it. Seriously, imagine the laundry situation. We're talking hundreds of yards of the stuff for a single mummy. This wasn't your fancy, Sunday best linen either. Often it was reused, old clothing, bed sheets, even sails. Kind of like recycling, ancient Egyptian style. But before you cringe, remember that everything was ritually cleaned and treated with respect. These strips, and I really mean strips, could be super long. Some have been found that were hundreds of feet long. The actual wrapping technique, well, it could get pretty elaborate. The limbs, fingers and toes were wrapped individually, like little linen sausages. This painstaking process was super important, ensuring each part of the body was preserved separately. Think of it as individual cryo-sleep pods for maximum preservation. Once the limbs were taken care of, the main body wrapping began. The priests, the morticians, they were super skilled, using different techniques to create intricate patterns and designs. Sometimes they'd even weave the linen in a diamond pattern, which is pretty cool if you ask me. It was like turning the mummy into a work of art, a very, very still work of art. But, and this is a big but, it wasn't just about the linen itself. What went inside the layers, what was nestled in between those linen strips, that's where the magic really happened. We're talking amulets, charms and all kinds of protective goodies. These weren't just pretty trinkets, they were essential for the mummy's safety and well-being in the afterlife. Amulets were everywhere. The ankh, symbolizing life, naturally a popular choice, often placed near the throat. The jed pillar, representing stability, frequently laid against the spine. Then there was the scarab, symbolizing rebirth. This was practically mandatory, usually placed over the heart, because, well, the heart had its own big plan. Speaking of the heart, there was a very special amulet for it, the heart scarab. This was often bigger and more elaborate than the other scarabs. And get this, it often had a spell inscribed on it from the Book of the Dead, specifically designed to prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased during the weighing of the heart ceremony. Imagine your own heart snitching on you. Not a good look when you're trying to get into paradise. But the amulets didn't stop there. There were tiny figures of gods and goddesses, protective animals, even miniature tools, all tucked amongst the linen. Each one had a specific purpose: protection against demons, ensuring safe passage through the underworld, guaranteeing the resurrection of specific body parts, you name it. One amulet that was almost always present was the Tayat amulet, sometimes called the Knot of Isis. It looks a bit like an ankh, but with the arms curved downwards. This was thought to invoke the protection of Isis, one of the most powerful goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon. Imagine having Isis as your personal bodyguard for the afterlife. Talk about VIP treatment. And where would you place these precious protectors? Well, a lot of them went on the torso, but also on the neck, or woven into the head wrappings. Some mummies have been found with hundreds of tiny amulets strategically placed all over their body. Talk about overpacking for a trip. The placement of the amulets wasn't random either. The priests would carefully follow specific instructions, consulting religious texts to ensure each amulet was placed in the correct location to maximize its power. It was like following a treasure map, except instead of gold, the treasure was eternal life. The colors of the amulets mattered too. Red, for instance, symbolized blood and power. Green represented regeneration and rebirth. Blue was associated with the sky and the gods. The materials used were also symbolic: carnelian for strength, lapis lazuli for royalty, faience for being pretty and blue. And it wasn't just amulets either. Sometimes little packets of natron, the same drying agent used to desiccate the body, were placed within the wrappings to further ensure preservation, a kind of bonus dryness, you could say. Beyond the individual amulets, entire pieces of papyrus, containing spells and prayers from the Book of the Dead, were sometimes placed between the layers of linen. These spells were like cheat codes for the afterlife, helping the mummy navigate the underworld and overcome any obstacles. Imagine having a guidebook to the afterlife. Pretty handy, right? So as the priests carefully wrapped each layer of linen, they were also building a protective shield, infusing the mummy with power and magic. Each amulet, each spell, each strip of linen, it all contributed to the ultimate goal, ensuring the mummy's safe passage to the afterlife. And get this, the whole process was pretty smelly too. You have the natron, you have the resins, and you have the dried remains. It couldn't have been pleasant to be around during that whole process, so these morticians were made of some hardy stuff. It's really fascinating to think about. The ancient Egyptians weren't just wrapping up dead bodies, they were creating something sacred, something powerful, something meant to last for eternity. They were investing everything they had, their time, their skills, their beliefs, into this one final act of love and devotion. And honestly, that's pretty beautiful, even if it involves a whole lot of smelly linen. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to dive deep into the opulent world of royal mummies. Forget those dusty old museum displays for a moment. We're talking pharaohs, queens, and the seriously elaborate rituals designed to secure their place in the afterlife. So why all the fuss about royal mummies anyway? Well, in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, they were seen as a living god, the link between the mortal world and the divine. Their death was a pretty big deal, disrupting the cosmic order, or so they believed. Mummification in their case was about ensuring the pharaoh's spirit, or care, could continue to maintain balance and prosperity for the entire kingdom from beyond the grave. Think of it as cosmic insurance, but with linen bandages, and the queens, often considered divine themselves, or at least heavily associated with the pharaoh's power, they got the royal treatment too. Their mummification was crucial not only for their own afterlife journey, but also to maintain the royal bloodline and validate the next ruler. These weren't just burials, they were carefully staged performances of power, religion, and political stability. Now let's talk specifics. While the general process of mummification was fairly consistent across Egyptian society, removing the organs, drying out the body with natron, wrapping it all up nice and neat, the royal mummies got a serious upgrade. Think of it as going from economy class to a private jet with unlimited champagne. First off, the materials. We're talking top-tier natron, the naturally occurring salt used for drying out the body. They didn't just grab any old salt, this was the good stuff, carefully sourced and probably blessed by a priest or two. Then there were the resins and spices. While commoners might have gotten a basic coating of something to help preserve the skin, the royals were slathered in layers of fragrant resins like frankincense and myrrh, imported from far-off lands at great expense. These weren't just for preservation, they were seen as having magical properties, warding off evil spirits, and helping the deceased transform into a divine being. Next up, the wrapping. Linen, and more linen. But not just any linen, we're talking the finest, whitest, most meticulously woven fabric you can imagine. Sometimes, thousands of yards were used for a single mummy, and each layer wasn't just slapped on, it was carefully applied by skilled embalmers, often accompanied by prayers and incantations. Every wrap was imbued with religious significance, a protective layer against the dangers of the afterlife. And then come the amulets. Oh, the amulets. While most mummies had a few strategically placed charms to protect them on their journey, royal mummies were practically weighed down with them. We're talking hundreds of individual amulets made from precious stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise, each with its own specific magical purpose. The scarab beetle for rebirth, the ankh for eternal life, the jade pillar for stability, you name it, they had it. These weren't just pretty decorations, they were essential tools for navigating the treacherous landscape of the afterlife. The mummy masks are another level up. instead of simple linen coverings, royal mummies often had elaborate masks made of gold, inlaid with precious stones and glass. These masks weren't just meant to depict the deceased, they were intended to transform them into a god. The most famous example, of course, is Tutankhamun's iconic gold mask, a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship. The mask ensured that the deceased pharaoh's face would be recognizable in the afterlife and help his spirit reunite with his body. But the real difference lies in the tomb itself. Forget simple graves. Royal mummies were buried in elaborate tombs filled with treasures meant to sustain them in the afterlife. We're talking furniture, clothing, food, weapons, chariots, even pets and servants, all carefully chosen to reflect the pharaoh's status and power. The Valley of the Kings near Luxor is the ultimate example, a vast necropolis filled with the tombs of pharaohs from the New Kingdom period. These tombs were designed not just as burial chambers but as miniature palaces for the afterlife, complete with decorated walls depicting scenes from the Book of the Dead and other religious texts. The burial rites themselves were also incredibly elaborate. The funeral procession would have been a spectacle of power, with priests, mourners, and soldiers accompanying the mummy to its final resting place. There would have been days of ceremonies, including prayers, incantations, and offerings to the gods. And of course, the sealing of the tomb, a ritual act meant to protect the mummy and its treasures for eternity. But here's the thing, all this effort didn't always guarantee success. Tomb robbers were a constant threat, and many royal tombs were looted throughout history, their treasures plundered, and their mummies desecrated. The fact that we found any royal mummies intact is a testament to the skill and ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians, as well as a bit of luck. One last thing, a quick cautionary tale. The level of obsession with the afterlife could lead to some pretty intense situations. In some cases, to ensure continued loyalty and service, beloved servants or even family members were sometimes sacrificed and buried with the pharaoh. It's a grim reminder that even in the most elaborate rituals, there could be a darker side to this intense preoccupation with the afterlife. Thankfully, this was not a widespread practice, and by the New Kingdom, symbolic representations often replaced actual human sacrifices. So next time you see a mummy in a museum, remember that it's more than just a wrapped body. It's a window into a complex world of religion, power, and belief, a reminder of the ancient Egyptians' enduring quest for immortality. And for the royals, it was a seriously stylish journey into the great beyond. Alright, so let's dive into something a little more exclusive, shall we? I'm talking about mummification, but not just for the big cheese pharaohs. We're going beyond royalty. Mummification practices among the Egyptian elite. Now, when we think of mummies, our minds usually jump straight to Tutankhamun, or maybe Ramses, right? Kings, queens, the head honchos. But hold on a sec. What about everyone else who was, doing well for themselves back in ancient Egypt? Did they just get tossed in a hole? Nah, my friend. They had options. See, the ancient Egyptians really believed in the afterlife. And I mean really believed. They thought that your body needed to be preserved as intact as possible, so your cow, that's your soul, more or less, could find its way back home after wandering around for a bit. So mummification wasn't just some weird ritual, it was a necessity for a successful journey into eternity. But naturally, not everyone could afford the deluxe package. The pharaohs got the 5-star treatment, complete with all the bells and whistles, but there were definitely tiered plans available in the afterlife preparation game. So, who qualified for something beyond a simple burial? Well, we're talking about the upper crust, nobles, high-ranking priests, scribes, military officials, and wealthy merchants, people with influence and, crucially, money. They could afford to pay the priests and embalmers to do a decent job of making sure their bodies were ready for the long haul. Now, the basic steps were pretty similar across the board. First off, you got to deal with the organs. I know it's kind of gross to think about, but it was super important. They believed that if the organs were left inside, they'd rot and mess up the whole vibe of the afterlife. So what did they do? They took them out and put them in canopic jars, specifically for the heart, lungs, liver, and intestines. But here's where things get interesting. For the really high-end mummies, the embalmers would sometimes use higher quality preservatives, like better resins and natron. That's a naturally occurring salt mixture to dry out the body. This meant the mummy would be better protected from decay and could theoretically last longer. We're talking about potentially making the difference between being a dusty mess and an archaeological find, right? And what about the wrapping though? Linen was the go-to material, but the quality of the linen could vary a lot. The elite could afford finer, higher-grade linen for their wrappings. Think of it like the difference between a threadbare sheet and some super soft Egyptian cotton. Plus, they'd use more layers, creating a thicker, more protective cocoon. They would use hundreds of yards of linen on one body, depending on how much money the family was ready to cough up. But it wasn't just about the linen, you know? It was also about the amulets. Amulets were like little charms that were placed between the layers of the wrappings to protect the mummy from harm and give them good luck in the afterlife. The more money you had, the more amulets you could afford. And not just more, but also better amulets, made from precious stones like lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian. These amulets weren't just for show though. Each one had a specific purpose. The D-jade pillar for stability, the ankh for eternal life, the scarab beetle for rebirth. It was like a spiritual security system, all carefully placed to ensure a smooth transition to the next world. Okay, so let's talk about the face then. While the pharaohs had those elaborate gold mummy masks that are the stuff of legends, the elite often had to settle for something a bit more modest. But that didn't mean they were neglected. They might have a painted cartonnage mask. That's like a mask made from layers of linen and plaster that was carefully molded to resemble the deceased. It was like a personalized portrait, ensuring that the K could recognize its body. Now, one really interesting thing about mummification among the elite is the effort they would make to preserve the facial features. Sometimes they would even use padding and stuffing to make the mummy look more lifelike. It was all about presenting the best possible version of yourself to the gods. But mummification wasn't just a solo gig, it was a family affair. The relatives of the deceased played a big role in the whole process. They were the ones who hired the embalmers, paid the bills, and made sure that everything was done according to tradition. And of course, they were also responsible for organizing the funeral. Funerals for the elite were big, elaborate affairs. Think processions, priests chanting, professional mourners wailing, and a whole lot of food and drink. It was like a final send-off to celebrate the life of the deceased and ensure their smooth passage to the afterlife. The tomb itself was also a reflection of the person's status. While the pharaohs had their pyramids and elaborate tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the elite often had their own private tombs, often found in places like Saqqara or Thebes. These tombs might not have been as grand as the royal ones, but they were still pretty impressive, often decorated with intricate paintings and filled with all sorts of grave goods. We're talking furniture, jewelry, pottery, even board games and food to ensure they're comfortable in the afterlife. They were basically setting up a second home in the great beyond. I guess one could say they were playing the long game, huh? And speaking of grave goods, that's another area where the elite really splurged. They wanted to make sure they had everything they needed in the afterlife, so they'd be buried with all sorts of treasures, jewelry, weapons, tools, even their favorite pets. It was like packing for an eternal vacation. But it wasn't just about material possessions. The elite also wanted to take their status with them to the afterlife, so they'd often be buried with items that symbolized their profession or social standing. Scribes might have their writing tools, military officials might have their swords, and priests might have their religious symbols. It was all about showing the gods who they were and what they'd accomplished in life. Now, I know this is a lot to take in, but it's important to remember that all of these practices were driven by a deep-seated belief in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians weren't just trying to preserve bodies, they were trying to preserve souls and ensure a successful journey into eternity. And for the elite, that meant sparing no expense to make sure they got the best possible afterlife experience. It was like planning the ultimate retirement party. So the next time you see a mummy in a museum, remember that it's not just a wrapped-up body, it's a window into the beliefs, values, and social structures of a fascinating ancient civilization. And it's a reminder that even in death, status and wealth could make a big difference. Alright, settle in, because we're diving deep, real deep, into a surprisingly popular aspect of ancient Egypt, animal mummies. Yeah, I know, you probably picture pharaohs and gold masks, but trust me, the world of animal mummies is just as fascinating, and it tells us a whole lot about Egyptian beliefs. Think about it, why would they mummify animals? Was it some kind of ancient Egyptian pet cemetery? Well, kinda, but it's way more complicated than that. Basically, we're looking at two main categories of animal mummies. First, we have sacred animals. These were animals that were considered living representations of specific gods or goddesses. So a bull, for example, might be seen as the earthly form of the god Apis. These weren't just any bull, mind you. They had to meet very specific criteria. Certain markings, a specific color, even the way their hair grew. When one of these sacred animals died, it was a huge deal. The Egyptians would go into full mourning, and the animal would be given a lavish mummification, often more elaborate than some human burials. These animals were then buried with great ceremony in special cemeteries, like the Serapeum at Saqqara, where hundreds of Apis bulls were laid to rest. Think massive sarcophagi, complex rituals, the whole shebang. We're talking about a serious investment of time, resources, and religious fervor. These animals weren't just pets, they were divine. Now, the other major category of animal mummies is what we call votive offerings. This is where things get really interesting. Votive offerings were basically gifts to the gods. People would commission these animal mummies, often from specialized priests or workshops, and then present them at temples as a way to, get on the good side of the deity, ask for a favor, or give thanks for something good that had happened. It was like sending a prayer through the mail, but instead of a letter, you were sending a mummified cat. The sheer scale of this votive offering industry is mind-boggling. We're talking millions, literally millions of animal mummies. I mean, can you even imagine the logistical nightmare of raising, killing and mummifying that many animals? Huge catacombs dedicated solely to cats have been discovered, filled with the remains of felines mummified to honor the goddess Bastet. Similar catacombs exist for dogs, ibises, falcons, crocodiles, you name it, they probably mummified it. And here's the kicker, not all of these mummies were exactly what they seemed. I mean, some were legit, perfectly preserved animals, but others, well, let's just say the ancient Egyptian consumer protection laws weren't exactly up to par. Think about it. The demand for these votive offerings was enormous. People wanted to show their devotion, but mummification was a complex and expensive process. So naturally, some less than scrupulous individuals started cutting corners. Archaeologists have found plenty of fake animal mummies. Some contain just a few bones wrapped in linen. Others are stuffed with mud, sticks, or even feathers. Sometimes they'd even use the same few bones to create multiple mummies. Talk about recycling. I mean, imagine going to return it. Excuse me, I think I have been scammed. I wanted an ibis, and I got a feather duster. Now, before you go judging these ancient Egyptian hustlers too harshly, remember that the intention was what really mattered. The belief was that the god would still receive the offering, even if it wasn't a perfectly preserved animal. It was the act of devotion, the sincerity of the prayer, that counted. Plus, let's be honest, it's not like the average person was going to unwrap the mummy to check its authenticity. They trusted the priests, and that was that. The spiritual return on investment was more important than the physical return on investment. So, what kind of animals were mummified as votive offerings? Well, cats are the most famous, definitely. Bastet, the cat-headed goddess, was incredibly popular, associated with protection, fertility, and motherhood. So, people would offer mummified cats to her in hopes of blessings for their families. Dogs were also common, associated with Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the afterlife. Offering a dog mummy could be a way to ensure safe passage into the next world. Ibises were linked to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, so offering an ibis mummy was like sending a request for knowledge or intelligence. Falcons were associated with Horus, the sky god, and were offered to pharaohs for protection. Crocodiles were linked to Sobek, a powerful and sometimes terrifying god associated with fertility and military success. Yeah, you probably wouldn't want to mess with Sobek, but it wasn't just these common animals. Egyptians mummified all sorts of creatures: snakes, fish, birds of prey, even insects. The specific animal depended on the god or goddess being honored and the particular request being made. Now, how did they mummify these animals? Well, the process was similar to human mummification, although often less elaborate and cheaper. The internal organs were sometimes removed. The body was dried with natron and then wrapped in linen bandages. Amulets and other protective charms were often included within the wrappings. The mummies were then placed in special coffins or containers, often decorated with images of the animal or the god it represented. The animal mummification industry gives us some amazing insights into the religious beliefs and practices of ancient Egypt. It shows us the importance of animals in their worldview, the complex relationships they had with their gods, and the lengths they would go to express their devotion. It also gives us a glimpse into the daily life of ordinary Egyptians, their hopes, their fears, and their constant efforts to navigate the complicated world of the divine. So, next time you think about ancient Egyptian mummies, remember that it wasn't just pharaohs and queens. There were millions of animals wrapped up in linen, offered to the gods, and buried in sacred catacombs. It's a whole other world of ancient Egyptian history just waiting to be explored. It is also good info if you are starting a collection. Alright, let's settle in and whisper our way through the Valley of the Kings. Just saying the name, Valley of the Kings, conjures up images, doesn't it? Sand, sun, secrets. It's basically Egypt's biggest treasure chest, tucked away in the hills, and we're about to peek inside. So picture this. We're not talking about just any burial ground. This is the place where pharaohs, the big bosses of ancient Egypt, decided to chill for eternity. Forget your local graveyard. This place was reserved for royalty and a select few very important people. Now, why this spot? Well, that's where the mystery gets juicier. For centuries, the pyramids were all the rage, right? Big, pointy, obvious monuments saying, "Hey, a pharaoh's buried here, come rob me." And people did, repeatedly. So as the old kingdom faded and the new kingdom rose, pharaohs got a little smarter. They needed a place that was both grand and hidden, and the Valley of the Kings fit the bill. It's this dramatic, desolate wadi on the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes' modern Luxor. The landscape itself is pretty stark: rocky cliffs, scorching sun, and a definite feeling of being far, far away from civilization. The idea was to blend in, to disappear into the landscape. Good plan in theory, but well, you know how that goes. The valley's natural shape helped. It's a narrow, winding place, making it easier to guard and harder to stumble upon accidentally. The surrounding cliffs provided a natural camouflage, and the Egyptians were masters of illusion when it came to hiding things. They picked this location not just for its seclusion, but also its connection to the west, which they associated with death and the setting sun, the journey into the afterlife. It was the perfect symbolic location too. Now, let's talk tombs. We're not talking simple holes in the ground. These were elaborate, underground palaces for the dead. Think of it as the ultimate do not disturb sign. Each tomb was unique, reflecting the pharaoh's status, reign, and personal beliefs. but they all followed a general blueprint. You'd have a descending corridor, sometimes several, leading to various chambers and halls. Walls were covered in vibrant paintings and hieroglyphs. These weren't just decorations, they were maps, spells, and stories designed to guide the pharaoh safely through the underworld. Think of it as an ancient GPS, with a spiritual twist. The burial chamber, of course, was the main event. That's where the sarcophagus containing the pharaoh's mummy rested, and around him, a treasure trove of everything he might need in the afterlife. Furniture, weapons, jewelry, food, even pets. It was like packing for the longest camping trip ever. And you bet they tried to booby-trap these tombs. False doors, hidden passages, maybe even a nasty curse or two. But spoiler alert, none of it was foolproof. For hundreds of years, the Valley of the Kings was a bustling place. Teams of skilled laborers, artists and craftsmen worked tirelessly, carving and decorating these elaborate tombs. It was a massive undertaking, a testament to the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife, and their dedication to honoring their pharaohs. The most famous tombs were naturally the royal tombs, but they also began burying queens and some nobles there as well. It's the family plot, if your family ran the whole country. Now let's switch gears and talk about discovery, because that's where the story gets even more exciting. For centuries, the Valley of the Kings was known, but its secrets remained largely hidden. Locals knew about it, of course, and some tombs had been looted in antiquity, but the full extent of its treasures wasn't revealed until the age of archaeology. Think of names like Howard Carter. This British archaeologist spent years searching for the tomb of Tutankhamun, a relatively minor pharaoh, armed with little more than a hunch and the financial backing of Lord Carnarvon. And then, in 1922, bam, he found it. What he found was the only royal tomb mostly intact. The discovery sent shockwaves around the world. It was like hitting the jackpot of ancient history. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't the biggest or most elaborate in the valley, but it was packed with treasures, golden masks, elaborate jewelry, chariots, furniture. It was like stepping back in time and seeing ancient Egypt in all its glory. The discovery ignited a worldwide Egyptomania, inspiring everything from fashion to film, and it reminded everyone that the Valley of the Kings still had secrets to reveal. Since Carter's discovery, archaeologists have continued to explore the Valley of the Kings, uncovering new tombs, re-examining old ones, and using modern technology to learn more about the people who were buried there. Think ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, all that cool stuff. There have been so many discoveries in the valley, it's hard to keep track. New tombs, new artifacts, new insights into Egyptian beliefs and rituals. Every discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, helping us to understand this incredible civilization just a little bit better. And the work is still going on. The Valley of the Kings continues to yield new secrets, even today. Archaeologists are constantly re-evaluating old theories, using new technologies to examine the tombs in greater detail, and searching for undiscovered chambers. Who knows what treasures and mysteries still lie hidden beneath the sands? It's like an ongoing treasure hunt, and we're all invited to watch. The mystery just keeps going. It really is like a giant history book, written in stone and buried in the sand, just waiting for us to keep reading it. And that is the allure and ongoing fascination that is the Valley of the Kings. Sleep tight. Alright, settle in folks. Tonight, or whenever you're listening, we're diving into something spooky, something that's fueled countless horror movies and late-night campfire stories, the curse of the pharaohs. But before you start picturing vengeful spirits and armies of the undead, let's put on our archaeologist hats and separate the fact from the fiction. Okay, so, where did this whole curse thing even come from? Well, it's not exactly ancient. You won't find hieroglyphs detailing the dire consequences of disturbing a pharaoh's slumber. The curse, as we know it, is largely a product of the 20th century, specifically, the frenzy surrounding the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. This was huge news. The world was absolutely captivated by the treasures, the mystery, the sheer spectacle of it all. Newspapers went wild, and with them so did the imaginations of the public. Now, here's where things get interesting. Shortly after the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy benefactor who funded the expedition, died. He passed away from pneumonia after nicking himself shaving and the subsequent infection becoming septic. A simple accident, really, but the press needed a story. Sensational headlines screamed about the pharaoh's curse, claiming Carnarvon's death as the first victim. And you know how news goes, other deaths linked to the excavation followed, some more tenuous than others. Arthur Mace, a member of the excavation team, died of arsenic poisoning, though it was never determined whether this was accidental, murder, or due to the effects of an illness. George J. Gould Sr. visited the tomb and soon after died of pneumonia, though at 64 years old and traveling the world, it wasn't that unusual. The media ate it up. Articles spun wild tales, fueled by superstition and a healthy dose of anti-Egyptian sentiment that was unfortunately prevalent at the time. It was all very dramatic, very exciting, and very, very profitable for those selling newspapers. But let's be real for a sec, guys. Are we really going to believe that a 3000-year-old curse is responsible for these deaths? Occam's razor, folks. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. And the simplest explanation here is that, well, tombs are kinda dangerous. Think about it. These things are sealed for centuries. What do you think is building up inside? Bacteria, fungi, all sorts of nasty stuff that our modern immune systems just aren't equipped to handle. We're talking about potential exposure to things like aspergillus, a common mold that can cause serious respiratory infections, histoplasmosis, another fungal disease found in soil and bat droppings, and let's not forget the potential for airborne particles of ancient materials, things that could irritate the lungs and cause inflammation. Plus, let's not forget that early 20th century hygiene and medical practices weren't exactly what they are today. A simple cut could easily become infected, and antibiotics were still a few decades away. So yeah, getting sick after poking around in a dusty sealed tomb isn't all that surprising. And another point to consider, the tombs themselves weren't exactly built to be safe. Deep underground, poorly ventilated, often unstable, it's a recipe for disaster. Rockfalls, collapsing tunnels, hidden shafts. These were all real dangers that faced early archaeologists. The focus was less on worker safety and more on what treasures could be acquired. So if it wasn't a curse, why all the eerie stories and warnings? Well, ancient Egyptians definitely believed in protecting their tombs. They weren't just going to leave all that treasure unguarded. But instead of relying on supernatural forces, they used a combination of practical measures and psychological deterrents. Think about it. Hidden entrances, booby traps, false doors and confusing mazes were all designed to deter tomb robbers. And then there were the inscriptions, not curses, exactly, but warnings, prayers to the gods, threats against anyone who would defile the tomb, pronouncements of doom. These were meant to scare off potential intruders, to make them think twice before disturbing the deceased. And guess what? They probably worked. Tomb robbing was rampant in ancient Egypt, but it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. You were risking your life, not just from physical dangers, but from the wrath of the gods, or at least the very persuasive rhetoric of the ancient Egyptians. So next time you hear about the curse of the pharaohs, remember, it's a great story, sure, but it's just that, a story. The real dangers of tomb exploration were far more grounded in reality, disease, accidents, and the very real efforts of the ancient Egyptians to protect their final resting places. It's a testament to the enduring power of myth, how a simple coincidence, combined with a bit of sensationalism, can create a legend that lasts for centuries. And it's a reminder that sometimes, the most fascinating stories are the ones rooted in reality, even if they're not quite as spooky as a curse. Now get some sleep, you crazy kids. Alright, settle in, friends, because this part is going to be all about the folks behind the curtain, the masters of the afterlife prep, the priests and the morticians. I mean, think about it. Mummification wasn't exactly a DIY project you could tackle on a slow Tuesday afternoon. It was a complex, ritualistic process, and you needed professionals, experts, people who knew their way around a recently departed individual. Now these weren't your run-of-the-mill priests, swinging incense and chanting, though there was definitely chanting involved. They were a specialized group, deeply knowledgeable about anatomy, chemistry, and of course religious doctrine. They weren't just winging it. We are talking about a sacred and well-documented art. Imagine the pressure. If you messed up, you weren't just getting a bad Yelp review, you were potentially jeopardizing someone's eternal existence. No pressure, right? So who were these mummification masters? Well, let's start with the main guy, the head honcho of the embalming workshop, the Curry Heb. Think of him as the project manager, the lead embalmer, the one who oversaw the entire process and made sure everything was done according to plan. He was usually a high-ranking priest, a real VIP in the religious hierarchy, and he would have been responsible for reciting the appropriate spells and prayers throughout the mummification. He was a master of ritual, and his very presence was essential to guaranteeing the transformation of the deceased. But the Curry Heb couldn't do everything himself, right? He had a whole team of assistants, each with their own specialized roles. You had the wetty wee, the embalmers themselves, the folks who actually got their hands dirty. They were the ones who performed the incisions, removed the organs, and applied the various preservatives. They were like the surgeons of the ancient world, but instead of fixing people, they were preserving them. Talk about a career change. And let's not forget the uchess, the bandagers, the masters of linen wrapping. These guys were like the ultimate gift wrappers, carefully encasing the body in layers upon layers of linen bandages, often incorporating amulets and other protective charms. This had to be perfect. Think of it as a cocoon. The way they wrap a body must be very precise. A sloppy wrapping wouldn't cut it. The uchess needed to be methodical, patient, and have a keen eye for detail. They weren't just wrapping, they were creating a work of art, a protective shell for the journey to the afterlife. The amulets are like little presents, tiny messages of hope for the deceased. Beyond these key roles, there were also other assistants involved in the process. Those who prepared the natron, the naturally occurring salt used for dehydration, those who prepared the resins and oils, and those who cleaned and maintained the workshop. It was a whole operation, a well-oiled machine, or maybe a well-oiled body preservation machine. Now, you might be wondering, where did these guys learn their trade? There weren't exactly mummification schools, right? Well, knowledge was typically passed down through families, from father to son, or from master to apprentice. It was a closely guarded secret, a tradition steeped in ritual and ancient wisdom. You couldn't just walk in off the street and become an embalmer. You had to earn it, prove your dedication, and learn from the best. And what about the workshops themselves? Where did all this mummification magic happen? Well, these workshops were typically located near temples or in specially designated areas, often on the west bank of the Nile, the side associated with the setting sun and the land of the dead. They were usually simple structures, with designated areas for washing, embalming, and wrapping. Think of them as ancient funeral homes, but with a much more hands-on approach. The priests and morticians weren't just technicians, they were also deeply spiritual figures, responsible for guiding the deceased through the transition to the afterlife. They recited prayers, performed rituals, and offered sacrifices to ensure the deceased successfully navigated the underworld and achieved eternal life. They were like the spiritual guides, the afterlife navigators, making sure their clients reached their final destination safe and sound. Now, let's talk about the social status of these mummification pros. Were they revered figures, or were they seen as creepy undertakers? Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, they held a vital role in ensuring a successful afterlife, which gave them a certain level of respect. On the other hand, they were dealing with dead bodies all day, which probably wasn't the most glamorous job in ancient Egypt. Some scholars believe that embalmers were actually considered ritually impure because of their constant contact with the dead. They might have been required to undergo purification rituals after each mummification to cleanse themselves of any negative energies. It's a bit of a mixed bag, right? They were essential but also maybe a little untouchable. Interestingly, we do know there were various levels of payment. The wealthier the deceased, the more elaborate the mummification. This means the priests and morticians could command a hefty fee for the services. It was a business, after all, even if it was a sacred one. So next time you see an ancient Egyptian mummy, remember it's not just a wrapped up body. It's the result of a complex process carried out by skilled professionals, the priests and morticians who dedicated their lives to ensuring eternal life for their clients. They were the unsung heroes of the ancient Egyptian afterlife, the masters of mummification, and their work is a testament to the ingenuity and spiritual beliefs of this fascinating civilization. Makes you wonder what their health plan looked like, doesn't it? Alright, let's dive into the nitty-gritty, the ingredients of mummification, shall we? It's easy to think of mummies as just bodies wrapped in linen, but behind those linen layers was a whole supply chain in play. Think of it, it's like trying to bake a cake, but instead of popping down to the grocery store, you're coordinating expeditions to different parts of the known world. Seriously, the logistical effort was staggering. And we're talking about substances with real spiritual significance, not just random bits and bobs. First, let's talk about the big one, natron. Natron was a naturally occurring salt mixture, primarily composed of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, that's table salt folks, and sodium sulfate. Now, this stuff was critical. Why? Because it's hygroscopic. Big word, I know. Basically, it sucked moisture out of the body. Ancient Egyptians would pack the body with natron, inside and out, to desiccate it. That is, to dry it out completely. This was key to preventing decay. Imagine trying to preserve something in the desert heat without a refrigerator. Yeah, natron was doing some serious heavy lifting. Where did they get it? Well, the best stuff came from the Wadi El Natron, a region west of the Nile Delta. This area had salt lakes that would evaporate in the sun, leaving behind these incredible natron deposits. Controlling access to the Wadi El Natron meant you controlled a key resource for mummification. Talk about valuable real estate. We're talking prime mummy ingredient territory here. But natron wasn't the only desiccant. Other salts were also used, possibly in combination with natron, or perhaps as a less expensive alternative. Common table salt could be used, and likely was, at least in some cases. After all, not everyone could afford the premium stuff from Wadi El Natron. Think of it as the difference between name brand and generic. It'll still do the job, but maybe not quite as well. Next up, resins and bitumen. These were used for a variety of purposes, including embalming, sealing, and providing a barrier against moisture. Resins came from trees, obviously, and different types of trees yielded different resins with different properties. Think pine resin, frankincense, myrrh, all very fragrant, all very useful. These resins help to preserve the tissues, kill bacteria, and frankly make the mummy smell a whole lot better. Let's be real, a desiccated corpse probably doesn't smell like roses without a little help. Bitumen, on the other hand, was a naturally occurring asphalt, basically a type of tar. It was used to coat the body and provide a waterproof barrier. It's even been suggested that the use of bitumen became more common later in Egyptian history, perhaps as resins became more scarce or more expensive. Where did these come from? Well, that's where the trade networks get interesting. Frankincense and myrrh, for example, were sourced from places like Somalia and Yemen, modern-day Punt, as the ancient Egyptians called it. Expeditions to Punt were a big deal, often depicted in temple reliefs and inscriptions. Think of them as ancient Egyptian shopping trips for the afterlife. We're talking boats laden with precious resins, exotic animals, and other valuable goods. Bitumen, it's believed, came from the Dead Sea region. Can you imagine the logistics of transporting all of this across vast distances in ancient times? And then there were the oils. Cedar oil, juniper oil, and various other plant-based oils were used to anoint the body, soften the skin, and provide additional preservation. These oils likely came from a variety of sources, both within Egypt and through trade with other regions. Linen was another major component. We're talking miles of linen strips to wrap the body. Egypt was a major producer of flax, the plant from which linen is made, so they had a ready supply of the raw material. But turning that flax into fine linen was a labor-intensive process. It had to be harvested, retted, that's soaking it in water to separate the fibers, spun into thread, and then woven into cloth. And we're talking fine linen, often of very high quality. Some of this linen was brand new, specifically woven for the purpose of mummification. Other linen came from used clothing. Talk about recycling. Finally, let's not forget all the little things: amulets, jewelry, and other grave goods. These weren't just randomly thrown in. Each item had a specific purpose, a specific meaning, designed to protect and aid the deceased in the afterlife. These items were often made from precious materials like gold, silver, and semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. These stones and metals came from various sources, both within Egypt and through trade. Lapis lazuli, for example, came all the way from Afghanistan. So, to recap, natron from the Wadi el Natron, resins from Punt, bitumen from the Dead Sea, linen from Egyptian flax fields, gold and gemstones from who knows where, and a whole lot of skilled labor to put it all together. It's like a global supply chain from thousands of years ago. The entire mummification process really puts the ancient world into a different light. It wasn't just pharaohs lounging around on thrones. It was a complex web of trade, resource management, and spiritual beliefs. It was a massive undertaking, involving specialists from all walks of life, from priests to embalmers, to linen weavers, to sailors braving the high seas to bring back valuable goods. And it's important to remember that the quality of the materials and the complexity of the process varied depending on the wealth and status of the deceased. A pharaoh would receive the royal treatment with the finest materials and the most skilled embalmers. A commoner might get a more basic, less expensive version of the process, or maybe no mummification at all. So next time you see a mummy in a museum, don't just think of it as a wrapped-up body. Think of all the effort, all the resources, all the trade, and all the beliefs that went into creating it. It's so much more than just linen and natron. It's a window into the entire ancient Egyptian world. Alright, settle in, because we're about to dive deep into how mummification changed over time. You might think, hey, a mummy's a mummy, right? But trust me, the ancient Egyptians were constantly tweaking their techniques, trying to perfect their process of preserving bodies for the afterlife. Think of it like upgrading your phone every few years. Same basic function, but with all the latest and greatest features. So where do we start? Early dynastic period. We're talking way back, around 3100 to 2686 B. Mummification, not exactly what you'd picture. It was more rudimentary. Think of it as nature's way of mummifying bodies. The Egyptians in their early days buried their dead in shallow graves in the desert. The hot, dry sand would naturally desiccate the bodies, drawing out the moisture and preserving them to some extent. It wasn't intentional mummification like we think of, but it was a start. The bodies were often wrapped in linen, but the wrapping was basic and served more to keep the sand off than to actively preserve the body. Then the Old Kingdom rolls around 2686 to 2181 BC. This is when things start to get a little more involved. The Egyptians realized that those naturally preserved bodies in the desert were doing okay, but they could do better. They started experimenting with different techniques, although it was still mainly reserved for the elite members of society. We're talking pharaohs, nobles, that kind of crowd. The process wasn't standardized yet. Different embalmers probably had their own preferred methods, and they were still working out the kinks. They began to remove some of the internal organs, though not all, and they didn't always do it through nice, neat incisions. Sometimes it was more forceful. The organs, if removed, weren't always preserved in canopic jars either. They might just be wrapped up with the body. The big jump comes with the Middle Kingdom, 2055 to 1650 BC. This is where we start seeing more deliberate and sophisticated techniques. The Egyptians realized that the internal organs were the first to decompose, so removing them became a more regular practice. We start seeing the consistent use of canopic jars to store the liver, lungs, stomach and intestines. Each jar was associated with one of the 4 sons of Horus, gods who protected the organs. Embalmers would also start using natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, to dry out the body. Natron was key because it absorbed the moisture that fueled decomposition. They'd pack the body with natron inside and out, leaving it to dry for about 40 days. The wrapping also became more elaborate, with layers of linen bandages and amulets tucked in to protect the body in the afterlife. Facial masks also began to appear, sometimes made of cartonnage, a kind of papier-mâché made from linen and plaster. But the real golden age of mummification, that's the New Kingdom, 50 to 1069. This is when the techniques reached their peak of sophistication. The process was still reserved primarily for the elite, but it became more accessible to a wider range of people. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, like Tutankhamun and Ramses II, received the most elaborate mummifications of all. The embalmers were true masters of their craft, using a standardized and highly effective process. Okay, so picture this. Step 1, the brain removal. Now this part isn't for the faint of heart. They'd use a hook to pull the brain out through the nostrils. Gruesome, right? But they believed the brain wasn't that important for the afterlife. The heart was the seat of intelligence and memory. Next, the internal organs were removed through an incision, typically on the left side of the abdomen. As we talked about, these organs were carefully preserved in canopic jars. Then the body was packed with natron to dry it out completely. After about 40 days, the natron was removed, and the body was washed and anointed with oils and resins to make the skin supple and fragrant. The wrapping process was incredibly elaborate. Layer upon layer of linen bandages, each carefully applied. Amulets were placed between the layers of linen to protect the body from harm in the afterlife. Scarabs, jade pillars, ankhs, all the classic Egyptian symbols. A mummy mask, often made of gold or cartonnage, was placed over the face to help the soul recognize its body. Finally, the mummy was placed in a sarcophagus, or multiple sarcophagi, decorated with elaborate scenes from Egyptian mythology. Now, even after the New Kingdom, mummification continued, but the quality started to decline a bit. During the late period 664 to 332 BC and the Ptolemaic period 305 to 30 BC, the techniques became less precise. The embalmers started using cheaper materials and taking shortcuts. Sometimes they wouldn't remove all the organs, or they'd use lower quality natron. The wrapping could be sloppy, and the amulets less elaborate. It's not that they stopped believing in the afterlife, but maybe the resources weren't there, or the skill wasn't as refined. There are a couple of theories floating around as to why the techniques were not as precise. The major one being that because the procedure was offered to everyone, embalmers would try to provide a quick, cheap option to those without wealth. Even with the decline, mummification continued well into the Roman period in Egypt. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained this practice was in Egyptian culture. It lasted for thousands of years, evolving and changing with the times, but always with the same goal: to prepare the body for eternal life. So there you have it. a quick tour of the evolution of mummification. From simple desert burials to elaborate New Kingdom masterpieces, the ancient Egyptians were constantly innovating, trying to perfect their process of preserving bodies for the afterlife. Each dynasty brought its own twists and turns, reflecting the changing beliefs and resources of the time. It's a fascinating story, and it really shows how important the afterlife was to the ancient Egyptians. And now, back to our regularly scheduled tomb raiding. Archaeological exploration. Alright, so let's dive into some modern mummy discoveries, and the new technologies helping us understand these ancient relics even better. It's honestly mind-blowing what we can learn these days. For years, mummies were, let's face it, kind of mysterious lumps wrapped in linen. We could see them, sure, and make some basic deductions about their size and maybe even their social status based on the decorations in their tombs. But really digging into who they were as people, that was tough. Now, we're pulling back those ancient curtains in ways they probably never imagined. One of the biggest game changers has been, without a doubt, non-invasive imaging techniques. Think about it. Unwrapping a mummy, while historically fascinating, is, well, it's destructive. You're potentially damaging fragile remains and losing valuable context. So scientists turn to technology that could see inside without ever having to touch a thing. CT scans or computed tomography are a prime example. These scans use X-rays to create incredibly detailed cross-sectional images of the mummy. We're talking about bone structure, soft tissues, even the stuff that's inside the wrappings. We can virtually unwrap a mummy, layer by layer, examine amulets placed within the bandages, and identify potential causes of death, all without disturbing the remains. And it's not just CT scans. MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, is another powerful tool. MRI uses magnetic fields and radio waves to generate images of soft tissues. This is especially useful for things like identifying tumors or other soft tissue abnormalities that might have been missed with X-rays alone. It's like having a super-powered, ancient body-specific flashlight. Think about the implications. We can now study diseases that plagued ancient populations. Did this person have heart disease, arthritis, cancer? The answers are locked inside those mummies, and these imaging techniques are unlocking them. And it's not just about medical conditions. We're learning about diet, lifestyle, and even social practices. By analyzing the contents of the digestive tract, which again, we can do non-invasively, scientists can piece together what people ate thousands of years ago. This gives us insight into the agricultural practices of the time, trade routes, and even social hierarchies. Was this person eating a lot of meat? Then they probably had access to resources that others didn't. Then there's radiocarbon dating. This technique has been around for a while, but it's constantly being refined and improved. Radiocarbon dating allows us to determine the age of organic materials, linen wrappings for example, with incredible accuracy. This is crucial for placing mummies within a specific historical context and understanding the evolution of mummification practices over time. Think about the bigger picture. Using radiocarbon dating, we can see how mummification techniques changed over centuries. Did they start using different materials? Did the process become more elaborate or simpler? These details give us clues about the religious and cultural shifts happening in ancient Egypt. And let's not forget about DNA analysis. Extracting DNA from mummies is a tricky process, since ancient DNA is often degraded and fragmented. But when scientists can get their hands on viable DNA, the results can be astonishing. We can learn about a mummy's ancestry, their genetic predispositions to certain diseases, and even their relationships to other mummies. It's like building a family tree that stretches back thousands of years. This helps us understand migration patterns, genetic diversity, and even the social structures of ancient Egyptian communities. One particularly interesting area of research involves studying the microbiome of mummies, the collection of bacteria and other microorganisms that lived on and inside their bodies. By analyzing these ancient microbes, scientists can learn about the diseases that were prevalent at the time, the environment in which people lived, and even how mummification processes affected the decomposition of the body. It's kind of like eavesdropping on a conversation between the mummy and its microscopic companions. Another really fascinating field is facial reconstruction. Using CT scan data, forensic artists can create incredibly lifelike reconstructions of what a mummy looked like in life. This isn't just about satisfying our curiosity, it's about humanizing these ancient individuals. Seeing a face, rather than just a wrapped body, helps us connect with them on a personal level, and remember that they were real people with lives, families, and dreams. There's an ethical component to this though. The use of these technologies on human remains, especially mummies, is a topic that is now being closely considered by museums, universities, and the public. How do we balance the scientific value of research with the respect and dignity that's owed to the deceased? It's not an easy answer. And finally, let's touch on some exciting new discoveries that have been made possible by these technologies. Recently, scientists have used CT scans to identify previously unknown amulets and religious symbols hidden within the wrappings of mummies. These discoveries shed new light on the religious beliefs and burial practices of ancient Egyptians. In some cases, they've even found evidence of advanced surgical procedures, suggesting that ancient Egyptian doctors were more skilled than we previously thought. Seriously, the possibilities are endless. And as technology continues to advance, we can only imagine what new insights we'll gain into the lives of these ancient individuals. Mummies aren't just wrapped bodies, they're time capsules holding secrets about the past that we're only just beginning to unlock. It's a pretty fascinating journey. Alright, settling in for a bit of science, are we? This is where it gets really interesting. We're diving into the DNA and the radiocarbon dating, the tools that let us peel back the layers of time and understand who these mummies really were. It's more than just dusty bandages and spooky stories. It's about unlocking their life stories. Bear with me as we delve into some fascinating topics. So first off, DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. The blueprint of life. Pretty cool stuff, right? I always thought it was. Even though mummification did a pretty good job of preserving bodies, it definitely wasn't ideal for keeping DNA intact. Over thousands of years, environmental factors like humidity, temperature changes, radiation, it all breaks down DNA into tiny fragments. Think of it like taking a really old book and crumbling it into dust. Not ideal, but not hopeless. The real breakthroughs came with advancements in DNA sequencing technology. Suddenly, we were able to analyze even these highly degraded samples. Scientists developed techniques to amplify the tiny bits of DNA they did find, making millions of copies so they could piece together the original genetic code. It's like finding a single grain of sand and then creating a whole beach from it. Now, this isn't as simple as just swabbing a cheek, like in CSI. Scientists usually have to drill into a bone or tooth, places where DNA is more likely to be protected, and then use specialized labs to prevent any contamination from our DNA. You wouldn't want to think that King Tut was actually related to the lab technician, would you? What are we actually learning from this ancient DNA? Well, a lot. We can determine the mummy's sex for starters. Obvious, right? Not always. Mummification rituals and burial practices sometimes blurred gender lines, so DNA provides concrete confirmation. It also helps us understand their ancestry. Who were their ancestors? Where did they come from? Genetic studies have shown that ancient Egyptians were closely related to populations in the Near East, the Levant, and even parts of Europe. Who knew, right? And family ties. Yep, DNA can help with that too. Scientists can identify family relationships between mummies found in the same tomb or area. We can confirm who was the son of whom, who was the wife of whom. Basically, the royal family tree becomes a bit less blurry. This is super helpful for understanding royal succession and the political landscape of ancient Egypt. It's like a really old episode of Keeping Up with the Pharaohs, but with science. But it's not just about family and ancestry. DNA can also give us clues about diseases. Scientists have found evidence of tuberculosis, malaria, and even schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease in mummy DNA. Knowing what illnesses plagued these people helps us understand their living conditions, their diets, and even how they might have died. Did a pharaoh suffer from a genetic predisposition to a certain disease? Did a commoner die from a widespread epidemic? DNA is helping us answer these questions. Now let's switch gears and talk about radiocarbon dating. Think of it as a biological clock that's been ticking for thousands of years. All living things absorb carbon from the environment, including a radioactive isotope called carbon-14. When an organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon, and the carbon-14 starts to decay at a known rate. By measuring the amount of carbon-14 left in a mummy's remains or its burial artifacts, scientists can estimate how long ago that person lived. It's like reading the rings of a really old tree. Radiocarbon dating is especially helpful for determining the age of mummies that lack inscriptions or other historical markers. Say, you found a mummy in an unmarked tomb. You couldn't read the hieroglyphs even if they were there, then radiocarbon dating can give you an approximate time frame. It helps us place the mummy within a specific dynasty or period, providing valuable context for understanding their life and culture. But just like DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating isn't perfect. Contamination from modern carbon can skew the results, and it's not super precise. You usually get a range of dates, not an exact year. Plus, it's more accurate for things that are older than, say, the Roman era. You can still use it for younger mummies, of course, just the range of error is larger as time passes. However, when combined with other dating methods and historical evidence, radiocarbon dating becomes a powerful tool for understanding ancient Egyptian chronology. The really cool part is, when you combine DNA analysis and radiocarbon dating, that's when things get really interesting. They complement each other beautifully. Radiocarbon dating gives you the when, and DNA analysis gives you the who, the what, and the how. You can use radiocarbon dating to confirm the age of a mummy, and then use DNA analysis to determine their sex, ancestry, and any diseases they might have had. For example, let's say you have a mummy dated to the reign of Ramses II using radiocarbon dating. DNA analysis reveals that the mummy was a young woman with close genetic ties to other members of the royal family. Suddenly you have a much clearer picture of who she was and her place in ancient Egyptian society. You might even discover that she was a previously unknown daughter of Ramses II, offering new insights into the royal family dynamics of that era. So what's the big picture here? Why is all this scientific mumbo-jumbo so important? Well, it's about more than just satisfying our curiosity. It's about understanding human history, about connecting with people who lived thousands of years ago. By studying mummies, we're not just learning about ancient Egypt, we're learning about ourselves, how our ancestors lived, how they died, what they believed in. It all helps us understand the human condition, and it's about honoring the dead. Mummies deserve our respect, and studying them scientifically is a way of giving them a voice. By uncovering their stories, we're ensuring that they're not just forgotten relics of the past but remembered individuals whose lives had meaning and purpose. And that, my friends, is pretty awesome. Jan, hope you found this informative and insightful. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to dive into a world where mummies aren't just dusty relics, but characters who've haunted our imaginations for centuries. Yeah, we're talking mummies in art and literature. It's a long, winding road, so get comfy. You know, the whole idea of a mummy, it's just ripe for storytelling, right? You've got this ancient being, preserved in linen, maybe cursed. The possibilities are endless. And artists and writers, they ate that up. Let's go back a bit. Before modern Egyptology really took off, Mummies were more myth than reality for most people. They showed up in medieval bestiaries, often described as some kind of magical substance, mumia, used in medicine. Seriously, people thought ground-up mummy bits could cure all sorts of ailments. Yikes. But things started to shift as Europe developed an increasing interest in all things ancient. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt at the end of the 18th century was a game changer. Suddenly, actual mummies were being brought back to Europe, and people were fascinated. This is where our story really kicks off. Romanticism, with its love of the exotic and the macabre, embraced the mummy. Think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. While not technically a mummy story, it's definitely playing with similar themes: reanimation, playing God, the horror of the unnatural. The monster, pieced together from corpses, is basically a modern twist on the ancient undead. And it wasn't just novels. Mummies popped up in poetry too. Edgar Allan Poe, naturally, couldn't resist. His short story, Some Words with a Mummy, is a satirical take on the Victorian obsession with Egypt. It's funny, it's weird, and it shows just how much mummies had captured the public's imagination. But it wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the mummy really became a star, especially in horror literature. Authors like Bram Stoker, yes, the Dracula guy, and Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes' creator, dabbled with mummy stories, each putting their own spin on the myth. However, one name really stands out here: Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, with lot number 249. I mean, come on, a reanimated mummy stalking the halls of Oxford University. It's a classic. This story really cemented the idea of the mummy as a terrifying, vengeful force. And then, boom, Howard Carter discovers Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Suddenly, Egyptomania went into overdrive. This discovery had a massive impact, not just on archaeology, but on art, fashion, and of course literature. Everything Egyptian was suddenly chic, and mummies were more popular than ever. This is when the curse of the pharaohs really took hold, right? People were convinced that disturbing Tut's tomb had unleashed some kind of ancient vengeance. And writers, they used that for all it's worth. The idea of a mummy's curse, it's just such a great plot device. You've got mystery, danger, the supernatural, it ticks all the boxes. And let's be honest, it adds a certain frisson to any mummy story. And art, wow. Think about it. The Art Deco movement was heavily influenced by Egyptian motifs. You see it in architecture, jewelry, fashion. It was everywhere. And that fascination trickled down into other art forms, naturally. Of course, we can't forget the movies. Seriously, where would we be without mummy movies? From Boris Karloff in the original The Mummy, 1932, to Brendan Fraser battling Imhotep in The Mummy, 1999, these films have kept the mummy myth alive for generations. These films amplified all those themes we've been talking about: the curse, the power of ancient magic, the clash between the ancient world and the modern one. And let's be real, they're just plain fun. But it's not all about horror, okay? Mummies can be found in a whole variety of genres. Romance, yes, really. Adventure, even comedy. They're incredibly versatile characters. Think about it. You have Hotel Transylvania, comedy gold. Why this enduring appeal? I think it's because mummies represent something fundamental about the human condition. They force us to confront our own mortality. They remind us that even the most powerful civilizations eventually crumble, and they raise questions about what happens after death. Plus, they're just cool. I mean, who wouldn't be intrigued by a figure from the distant past, wrapped in linen and shrouded in mystery? It's a potent combination, and that potent combination translates into art and literature that's as captivating today as it was centuries ago. So next time you see a mummy in a book, a movie, or even a museum exhibit, remember that you're not just looking at a preserved body. You're looking at a character who has evolved over centuries, shaped by our fears, our hopes, and our endless fascination with the past. They're more than just wrapped bodies, right? They're reflections of ourselves, and that, my friends, is pretty powerful stuff. Alright, so mummies in popular culture, huh? That's a bit of a leap from the ancient burial rituals we've been exploring, but stick with me. It's actually pretty fascinating how these wrapped-up relics have wriggled their way into our modern imaginations. I mean, think about it. How many images pop into your head when you hear the word mummy? Probably not ancient religious devotion. More likely, it's Boris Karloff lumbering around, or maybe Brendan Fraser fighting off hordes of them. For better or worse, mummies in pop culture are usually portrayed as, well, monsters. The whole mummies curse thing really took off, and it's been a running theme ever since. It's interesting, because the ancient Egyptians saw mummification as a sacred process, a vital step in ensuring eternal life. But we, as a culture, often see it as something creepy, a violation of the natural order. The idea of someone coming back from the dead, especially if they're dusty and wrapped in bandages, taps into some pretty primal fears. It's the whole undead trope dialed up to 11. The modern mummy craze, you could argue, really kicked off with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. The world was gripped by Egyptomania, and that quickly translated into movies, books, and all sorts of media. The curse of Tutankhamun, whether real or fabricated, only fueled the fire. Suddenly, everyone was fascinated by ancient Egypt, and mummies were right at the center of it all. Of course, horror films were quick to capitalize. The 1932 film The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, is the classic. It established so many of the tropes we still see today. The ancient priest brought back to life, the mystical powers, the slow, shuffling walk. Karloff's portrayal is iconic, even if it's not exactly accurate. But you know, accuracy isn't always the point. It's about creating a mood, a sense of dread, and that movie did it perfectly. And it didn't stop there. Countless other mummy movies followed, each adding its own spin. Some were genuinely scary, others were more campy, but they all contributed to the image of the mummy as a creature to be feared. Think of it this way: vampires have their charm, werewolves have their tragic side, but mummies are just unsettling. But it's not all horror. Mummies have also popped up in other genres. The Mummy franchise with Brendan Fraser, for example, is more of an action-adventure series with some horror elements thrown in. Those movies are more about thrills and excitement, less about pure terror. Plus, they brought a new generation into the mummy fandom. They took the old tropes and updated them for a modern audience, with bigger special effects and more elaborate action sequences. Okay, lots bigger special effects. And you know the whole mummy thing goes beyond movies. There are mummy books, mummy comics, mummy video games. Mummies are everywhere, even cartoons. Did you ever watch Mummies Alive, back in the 90s? I know I did. It just proves how pervasive the mummy image is in our culture, even for kids. They're definitely a reliable monster when you want something that's both spooky and kinda funny. But let's not forget the other side of the coin, museums. Because while mummies are monsters on the big screen, they're also invaluable historical artifacts. Museums around the world display mummies, often with great care and respect. They're presented as a way to learn about ancient Egyptian culture, religion, and burial practices. Seeing a real mummy up close can be a pretty powerful experience. It's a direct connection to the past, a tangible link to a civilization that existed thousands of years ago. Museum exhibits can be a real counterpoint to the scary mummy image. They show the science and the artistry behind mummification, and they emphasize the humanity of the people who were mummified. It's a reminder that these weren't just monsters, they were real people with lives, families, and beliefs. Of course, there's always a bit of tension there. Is it ethical to display human remains, even if they're thousands of years old? That's a question that museums are constantly grappling with. It's important to balance the desire to educate and inform with the need to treat the deceased with dignity and respect. So mummies in popular culture, from horror films to museum exhibits. It's a pretty wide range, isn't it? On one hand, we have the scary, curse-wielding monsters of the movies. On the other, we have the carefully preserved relics of the museums, offering insights into a long-lost world. Both images, in their own way, reflect our fascination with death, the afterlife, and the mysteries of the past. And you know what? That's pretty cool. It just goes to show you how one image can have completely different meanings. Now what's next? Oh yeah, the ethical considerations. That's a big one, but we'll tackle it together. Time for another breath. Almost there. Okay, so mummies, they're not just creepy decorations, right? They were once real people, with lives, families, and stories. And that brings us to a pretty tricky question. Is it okay to display their remains in museums? This is a debate that's been going on for a while, and there really aren't any easy answers. On one side, you have the argument that mummies are incredibly valuable historical artifacts. They offer us a unique glimpse into the past, teaching us about ancient cultures, religious beliefs, and even medical practices. By studying mummies, scientists can learn about diseases that plagued ancient populations, understand how people lived, and even trace lineages. I mean, think about it. We can learn so much about ancient Egyptians through these preserved bodies. Wouldn't it be a shame to hide that knowledge away? Plus, museums often argue that they have a responsibility to educate the public. Displaying mummies, they say, can spark curiosity and inspire people to learn more about history. When you see a mummy behind glass, it's a pretty powerful experience. It's a direct connection to a person who lived thousands of years ago. It can make history feel a lot more real and relevant, especially for younger generations. But then, there's the other side of the coin. The argument that displaying human remains, even ancient ones, is deeply unethical. These were once living, breathing people, and many believe that they deserve respect and dignity, even in death. Think about it. How would you feel if your great-great-great-grandparents were put on display for everyone to gawk at? For many cultures, including some indigenous communities today, the treatment of the dead is a sacred matter. They believe that disturbing the remains of ancestors can disrupt the spirit world and bring bad luck. Even if the ancient Egyptians themselves practiced mummification, does that give us the right to put their bodies on display thousands of years later? It's a completely different context, right? There's also the issue of consent. Obviously, the mummies themselves can't give permission to be displayed, so who has the right to decide what happens to their remains? Should it be the museums? Should it be descendants if they can be identified? Or should we simply err on the side of caution and keep them out of the public eye? Another point to consider is the potential for cultural insensitivity. Let's face it, a lot of people go to see mummies out of a sense of morbid curiosity, or even to be a little spooked. Are we really honoring these individuals and their culture when we treat them as nothing more than a spectacle? Some critics argue that displaying mummies can perpetuate stereotypes and dehumanize ancient cultures, turning them into exotic objects for our amusement. And it's not just about mummies from Egypt. This debate applies to human remains from all over the world. For example, there have been controversies surrounding the display of indigenous remains in museums in North America and Australia. Many indigenous communities have fought for the repatriation, which means the return of their ancestors' remains, arguing that they were often obtained unethically in the first place, like through grave robbing. They believe that these remains should be reburied according to their traditional customs. So what's the solution? Well, some museums are trying to find a middle ground. They might display casts or replicas of mummies instead of the real thing. This allows people to learn about the mummification process without disrespecting the actual remains. Other museums are working closely with descendant communities to determine the best way to handle human remains in their collections. This might involve reburial, repatriation, or displaying the remains in a more respectful and culturally sensitive way. For instance, instead of just putting a mummy in a glass case, a museum might create an exhibit that focuses on the person's life, their beliefs, and their contributions to their society. Ultimately, there's no easy answer to the question of whether or not it's ethical to display human remains. It's a complex issue with strong arguments on both sides, but by having these conversations, by considering the different perspectives involved, and by prioritizing respect and sensitivity, we can hopefully find a way to balance the desire to learn about the past with the need to honor the dignity of the dead. It's about finding that sweet spot, that respectful middle ground where we can honor their lives through research and respect. And it's not just about the past. How we treat these remains reflects our own values and beliefs about death, respect, and the importance of preserving history in an ethical and thoughtful way. Think about what you would want to be done with your remains and how that might impact your feelings about the remains of others. Maybe, just maybe, that's the most important thing we can learn from these ancient mummies, not just about their lives, but about ourselves. Alright, so let's peek into the crystal ball of mummy research, shall we? We've learned so much already, but honestly, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface. Imagine the possibilities. One of the biggest areas of focus is definitely non-invasive imaging. Think of it like giving a mummy a super-powered medical checkup without even unwrapping it. We're talking advanced CT scans, which give us incredibly detailed 3D models of what's inside those layers of linen. It's not just about bone structure, it's about soft tissues, organs, even things like brain preservation, which is still a huge mystery in many cases. These scans can reveal a person's age, their health at the time of death, and sometimes even what might have caused their death. Then there's the tech side, like virtual unwrapping. It's exactly what it sounds like, using computer software to peel back those layers of linen digitally. We can see the mummy's face, their jewelry, the amulets tucked in with them, all in astonishing detail, without ever disturbing the original wrapping. It's like a high-tech archaeological strip-tease, if you will, but completely respectful and non-destructive. And speaking of tech, ancient DNA, or a DNA, is a game changer. Successfully extracting and analyzing a DNA from mummies is tough, I won't lie. The hot, dry climate of Egypt, while great for preservation in some ways, can also degrade DNA over thousands of years. But when we can get it, the information is incredible. We can learn about a person's ancestry, their genetic predispositions to certain diseases, and even track migrations and population movements across ancient Egypt. It's basically like Ancestry.com, but for people who lived millennia ago. But here's where it gets really interesting: proteomics. While a DNA can be degraded, proteins are often more stable over time. Proteomics is the study of proteins, and by analyzing the proteins found in mummies, we can learn about their diet, their health, and even what kind of embalming fluids were used. It's a whole new avenue for understanding ancient mummification practices and their effectiveness. One of the biggest unanswered questions is still the embalming process itself. We know generally what they did: remove organs, dry the body, wrap it in linen, etc. But the specific recipes for embalming fluids, the exact techniques used, and the variations across different time periods and social classes are still largely unknown. There's a lot of guesswork that goes into it. Still, were there regional differences? Did the ingredients change over time based on availability or cost? Did the specific instructions get passed down through familial lines of embalmers? And were there secrets to the trade that we are still not privy to? For example, we know they used natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, for dehydration. But what else did they use? We find hints of resins, oils, beeswax, and various plant extracts. But pinpointing the exact ingredients and their proportions is a massive challenge. It's like trying to recreate a recipe from a cookbook where half the pages are missing, and the measurements are all in ancient Egyptian units. And then there's the question of why some mummies are so much better preserved than others. Was it the individual skill of the embalmer, the quality of the materials, or were there environmental factors at play, like the location of the tomb or the specific microclimate within the burial chamber? The answer is probably a combination of all these things, but figuring out the precise formula is a huge puzzle. Another area of exciting research is the study of ancient diseases. Mummies can provide a unique window into the history of human health and disease. We can find evidence of tuberculosis, arthritis, even things like atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. Understanding these ancient diseases can give us insights into how they evolved over time and how they affect us today. Think about it, we can study diseases that no longer exist the way they are now because they existed in a completely different ecosystem. But it's not just about physical health, it's also about mental health. Could we potentially find evidence of mental illness in mummies? That's an exciting but complex consideration. It's a long shot, of course, but as our understanding of ancient brains and their preservation improves, it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Imagine the ethical and analytical hurdles, though, and let's not forget about the ethical considerations. As we develop new technologies and gain access to more information about mummies, it's crucial that we treat these remains with respect and sensitivity. There are ongoing debates about whether it's ethical to display mummies in museums, to conduct destructive research on them, or even to unwrap them at all. These are complex questions with no easy answers, and it's important that we involve descendant communities and indigenous voices in these discussions. After all, we are talking about real people who deserve to be remembered and respected. The future of mummy research is bright, but it requires a multidisciplinary approach. We need archaeologists, Egyptologists, geneticists, radiologists, chemists, and ethicists all working together to unlock the secrets of these ancient remains. It's a collaborative effort that will push the boundaries of what we know about ancient Egypt and about ourselves. And honestly, just thinking about the possibilities is enough to keep me up all night. Well, almost. So, what new questions will arise? What amazing discoveries await us? Only time and a lot of careful research will tell. But one thing is for sure, the story of ancient Egyptian mummies is far from over, and there are still plenty of mysteries waiting to be unwrapped. Alright everyone, settle in, because we're diving into the really profound stuff now, the spiritual DNA, if you will, of mummification. We're not just talking about embalming fluid and bandages here, we're talking about a complete life-altering shift in how an entire civilization perceived death and the afterlife. Think about it. Mummification wasn't just some quirky practice. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. It was, frankly, a bit gruesome. So why go through all that trouble? Well, for the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't the end. It was a doorway, a transition, and mummification was the ultimate preparation for that journey. Their entire belief system hinged on the idea that the human soul, or rather the multiple components of the soul, could live on eternally, but only if the physical body remained intact. Key to this survival was the ba and the ka. The ba is often depicted as a bird with a human head. Think of it as your personality, your unique essence, the thing that makes you you. The ba was free to roam the earth during the day, but needed to return to the mummified body each night to be sustained. Without a preserved body, the ba would be lost, and eternal life would be, well, let's just say it wouldn't be. Then there's the ka, a kind of spiritual double, or life force. The ka remained in the tomb with the body, and needed sustenance. That's why tombs were filled with food, drink, and other provisions. The ka depended on these offerings to survive in the afterlife. So you see, mummification wasn't just about preserving a corpse. It was about ensuring the continued existence of both the ba and the ka. Without a preserved body, the ba would have nowhere to return, and the ka would starve. The result? Spiritual annihilation. Pretty high stakes, right? But the Egyptians didn't stop there. They believed that after death, the deceased had to undertake a perilous journey through the underworld, known as the duat. Imagine a dark, treacherous landscape filled with monsters, traps, and all sorts of nasty surprises. To navigate this journey, the deceased needed the right tools, spells, amulets, and crucially, the knowledge of how to outsmart the underworld's guardians. That's where the Book of the Dead comes in. This wasn't a single standardized book, but rather a collection of spells and incantations written on papyrus scrolls, which were then placed in the tomb with the mummy. Think of it as a spiritual guidebook, a cheat sheet for navigating the afterlife. The Book of the Dead contained everything the deceased needed to know to overcome the challenges of the duat, from spells to ward off evil spirits, to instructions on how to answer the questions posed by the gods. And speaking of the gods, they played a huge role in the whole afterlife scenario. After successfully navigating the duat, the deceased would arrive in the Hall of Ma'at for the weighing of the heart ceremony. This was the ultimate judgment. The deceased's heart, considered the seat of their intellect and emotions, was placed on one side of a scale, and a feather, representing Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, was placed on the other. If the heart was lighter than the feather, it meant the deceased had lived a virtuous life, and they were granted access to the field of reeds, a paradise where they could live eternally in bliss. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, it meant the deceased had been wicked, and their heart would be devoured by Ammit, a fearsome creature with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. The result? Total and utter destruction. No afterlife. No eternal life. Just oblivion. This weighing of the heart ceremony was a powerful symbol of the importance of living a moral life. The Egyptians believed that your actions in this world had direct consequences in the next. So it wasn't enough just to preserve your body, you also had to live a good life to ensure a favorable judgment. Now let's think about the implications of all this. Mummification, the Book of the Dead, the dua, the weighing of the heart. It all adds up to a complex and sophisticated belief system centered on the idea of eternal life. And this belief system had a profound impact on Egyptian society. It shaped their art, their architecture, their literature, and their daily lives. The pyramids, those colossal monuments to the pharaohs, weren't just tombs, they were gateways to the afterlife, designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition to the next world. The elaborate tomb paintings and carvings weren't just decorations, they were visual representations of the afterlife journey, intended to guide and protect the deceased. Even the amulets that were wrapped with the mummies had a specific purpose to protect the deceased from harm and to ensure their successful passage through the dua. The scarab beetle, for example, was a symbol of rebirth and renewal, while the ankh represented eternal life. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Egyptian belief system was its influence on their moral code. The belief that your actions in this life had consequences in the next encouraged people to live virtuous lives, to uphold justice, and to treat others with kindness. After all, who wants to face Ammit and have their heart devoured? So the next time you see an Egyptian mummy in a museum, remember that it's more than just a wrapped-up body. It's a tangible reminder of a civilization that believed in the power of eternal life, and that shaped its entire society around that belief. It's a testament to the enduring human desire to overcome death and to find meaning beyond the grave. It's a window into a world where the spiritual and the physical were inextricably linked, and where the journey to the afterlife was just as important as life itself. Sleep tight. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's really think about this whole mummy thing for a bit. We've spent all this time diving deep into the how and why of ancient Egyptian mummification. But what does it mean? What's the big deal? See, it's easy to get caught up in the linen wrappings, the canopic jars, the Valley of the Kings, the sheer technical brilliance of it all. And trust me, it is mind-blowing. But at its core, mummification wasn't just some elaborate embalming process. It was a profound statement about life, death, and the enduring human need to believe in something beyond what we can see and touch. Think about it. For thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians poured an unbelievable amount of resources, time, and frankly, effort into preserving their dead. Not just the pharaohs, either. While royal mummies are the rock stars, mummification, in varying degrees, was practiced across many levels of Egyptian society. This wasn't a casual thing, it was a cultural obsession really. and that obsession speaks volumes. What did they believe they were achieving? They weren't just trying to cheat death, or at least not in a simplistic live forever kind of way. They were preparing for a journey. The afterlife wasn't just some abstract concept, but a very real place they believed they would inhabit. And the better prepared you were, the smoother that transition would be. Mummification was like packing your suitcase for the ultimate vacation, only the destination was eternity. And the fact that they went to such incredible lengths demonstrates an unwavering faith, a faith in Osiris, in the weighing of the heart, in the possibility of resurrection. It's a tangible representation of their deepest spiritual beliefs, something that continues to resonate with us even today. But beyond the religious aspect, consider the respect inherent in the process. They were treating the deceased with incredible care and dignity. The removal of organs, the meticulous wrapping, the placement of amulets, even the painting of the mummy masks, it all speaks to a profound sense of reverence for the individual. Think about it. They wanted to present their loved ones, their ancestors, in the best possible light for their encounter with the gods. It's a powerful testament to the value they placed on human life, even in death, and that's something we can all connect with, right? I mean, we might not believe in the same specific rituals or deities, but that fundamental human desire to honor the departed, to remember them, to keep their memory alive, that's universal. It's also about legacy. These weren't just nameless bodies being stuffed into the ground. These were individuals who had lived, loved, contributed to their society, and who wanted to be remembered. By preserving their bodies, they were, in a sense, preserving their identities, their stories. They were saying, I was here, I mattered, I will not be forgotten. And well, they certainly achieved that, didn't they? We're still talking about them thousands of years later. And that leads us to another fascinating aspect, the power of objects. Amulets, jewelry, furniture, even food were placed in the tombs alongside the mummies. These weren't just random trinkets. They were carefully chosen items meant to aid the deceased in the afterlife, providing comfort, protection, and sustenance. Each object tells a story, offering us insights into the beliefs, values, and daily lives of the ancient Egyptians. And these objects connect the mummies back to the world they left behind. But maybe, just maybe, the most significant thing about ancient Egyptian mummies is the way they've captivated our imaginations for centuries. Why are we still so fascinated by them? Why do they show up in our movies, our books, our museums? What is it about these ancient wrapped bodies that still hold such power? I think it's because they represent a bridge to the past. They offer us a tangible connection to a civilization that was both incredibly advanced and deeply mysterious. When we look at a mummy, we're not just looking at some dusty old remains. We're looking at a person who lived, breathed, felt, just like us. We are coming face to face with someone who walked this earth millennia ago, and that's pretty humbling. They remind us of our own mortality. Facing a mummy forces us to confront the inevitability of death and to reflect on our own lives and legacies. What will we leave behind? How will we be remembered? These are big questions, the kind that tend to float around in the quiet dark when you're trying to get to sleep. And in a way, mummies offer a sense of hope. The ancient Egyptians believed in the possibility of an afterlife, a continuation of existence beyond the physical realm. And while we might not share their exact beliefs, the fact that they held on to that hope, that they invested so much in preparing for it, is inspiring. It suggests that there's something within us that resists the idea of total oblivion, a longing for something more. So the next time you see a mummy, whether it's in a museum or on the big screen, take a moment to really think about it. Don't just see a wrapped up body, see a testament to human ingenuity, to unwavering faith, to the enduring power of hope and memory. See a connection to a civilization that, despite its distance in time, continues to speak to us in profound and meaningful ways. Because ancient Egyptian mummies are so much more than just wrapped bodies. They're reflections of ourselves, our fears, our dreams, and our deepest beliefs about life, death, and everything in between.